My name is Louise Bennett, and I'm moderating this session. The workshop has been organised by the British Computer Society because our membership, which is we're a 70,000 people membership organisation, every year they say the main things that they want us to do on their behalf. And this year they said that they wanted us to bring the questions of identity assurance on the internet to the attention of our government and international institutions. Consequently, myself, Andy Smith and Ian Fish, who are all volunteers in the BCS and do day jobs at other times, but I chair the Security Community of Expertise. Ian Fish chairs the Security Special Interest Group and the Privacy Panel. And Andy is a member of both of those, and they'll say more about themselves later. Ian is doing the remote moderation, so he won't be speaking in the panel, but he'll be answering questions, but he'll be trying to ensure that we have a good dialogue with our remote participants. The other member of our panel, which we're very pleased to have here, is Alan Michael MP. He's the MP for South Cardiff and Penarth in Wales. And we've been working with him for many years. As many of you will know, he's been involved in the IGF from its inception. And we've been working with him through URIM, the Information Society Alliance, on many things, including identity governance on the internet. The three topics that we want to cover are, very briefly, privacy and security, the balance between those, identity governance on the internet, and trust in remote identities. Now, when phones, fixed and then mobile, were first used, they were used for one-to-one conversations. You decided who you wanted to call, and you usually recognized the voice of the person you were talking to. You knew who they were, and you knew that you trusted them. If you rang your mother, you knew it was your mother answering the phone because you recognized the biometric of her voice. In just the same way, when the internet was first used over 20 years ago, it was used by a limited number of people and organizations who knew and trusted each other. It was like an extension of one-to-one conversations between trusted people. It was an extension of what people have been doing for years. Now the internet can link everyone and everything. In 2010, there were an estimated 35 billion IP-based devices on the internet. The estimate for 2013 is over 1 trillion, including linking over half the population of the world. Now, you cannot know, let alone trust, all of these people. The greatest vulnerability now is really from mobile access. You may think you know whose phone you're communicating with, but if you just think of a few statistics that we have in the UK, last year, over 20% of people lost their mobile phones or had them stolen. And I'm sure that kind of statistic probably holds for other countries. But more importantly, over 60% of those people didn't even have a PIN on their phone, let alone any more sophisticated security. So it's an inescapable truth that you can neither know who you're communicating with on the internet, nor who owns, let alone who is using the device or the IP address that you're communicating with. However, you do need to know both of these things. You need to know who's at the other end and who they legitimately represent, be it a government or a business, if you want to benefit from internet services and transactions. And that's why the management of identity on the internet is really so important. We've discussed this topic in the UK at InfoSec with our own membership of 70,000 people, at Eurodig in Serbia, and now here in the IGF. It's a very complex issue, and we want to speak for a short time and really hope that we'll have a good dialogue with you. I'd now like to hand over to Andy Smith.
Good morning. I'm actually going to do something slightly interesting here. One of the things that we've noticed at InfoSec, more so at Eurodig, but also here, is there is a tendency to get the balance between privacy and security skewed more towards the privacy side. So I'm going to try and redress that and talk a little bit about the national security implications and the other aspects of this balance. Because it's not just the human rights, the rights to privacy and the data protection of all of the individuals that are on the internet. It's also the rights to privacy and the human rights of all of the victims of cybercrime. And people really do not understand the sheer volumes, the statistics behind victims of cybercrime. Every year, millions of people have their lives disrupted, their life savings stolen, they have organized crime, abusing children. We have a number of aspects of crime on the internet and very poor ways of actually being able to deal with these. So looking at the national security side, terrorist acts happen in the physical world, but more and more we're seeing these being organized, coordinated through the internet, through communications over the internet. It's a great way for terrorist organizations to hide what they're doing. It's a lot harder to listen in and gather information from encrypted communications going over the internet than it is from mobile phones or more traditional forms of communication. So we need privacy, we need to protect people's rights, but we also need to be able to track down, stop wherever possible, and wherever we can't stop, we need to be able to prosecute those that commit heinous crimes either on the internet or using the internet as a communications media. So, but we've still got this other aspect. We've got this balance, and the balance is there, and it's fundamentally important. So if you look at some of the things that have happened in the past, when the Nazis went into the Netherlands, they just pulled all of the records that the Dutch authorities had, and it allowed them to identify every single Jew. So it made it very easy for them to round up the Jews and stick them on trains. So we do need to protect people's privacy. We do need to protect people's rights. But we've got to get this balance right. So looking at identity management, looking at how identities are used on the internet, in the old days, you had a trusted registration process. So someone would go and apply for a passport, they'd turn up in person, they'd have their forms filled in, they'd do the background checks, corroborate the information, and a trusted organisation, usually the government, would issue them credentials like a passport, driving licence, identity card. Or if it was a bank, they'd issue them with a credit card and a bank account, etc. And they could then use this set of trusted credentials, in the case of a bank, a credit card with a PIN number, to do transactions over trusted infrastructure like the ATM and EPOS networks, and usually in a supervised environment like a shop or a bank or some other trusted location. So this is all nice. This is pretty simple. You've got some level of trust because it's a supervised environment and it's trusted infrastructure. But on the internet, we've got a completely different scenario. There's a lot of bad people out there, and organised crime are more and more working out that they've got a large target market on the internet, and they can make a lot of money, both because of human error, but through social engineering, psychological manipulation, all sorts of tactics and techniques. They can make a lot of money from people on the internet, and they can do it from countries or places where they stand very little chance of either being caught or prosecuted. That's interesting. We've had a power failure, but my slides are still up there. That's good. There's only a partial power failure.
Right.
So we've got the situation where people are using the internet and they want to use it for commercial applications, be that purchasing things from Amazon, eBay, using PayPal to buy things from various other online shopping sites, or using their credit cards through bank transactions to purchase stuff over the internet. And lots and lots of people in England now don't even bother going to Tesco's. They actually do their shopping online, and their eggs and bacon turn up in the back of a lorry. And this is all well and good as long as you can trust not only the individuals who are making the purchases, but those individuals can trust they are actually talking to legitimate organisations. So you need this mutual authentication between the individual and the organisation that they're dealing with. The one problem that we still face, and the one problem that we still haven't got sorted that well, is the initial registration. When you're doing remote registration of an individual, how can you prove you're talking to the right person? How can you actually be sure that the person you are enrolling or registering into your system is who they claim to be? I can give you some really good examples of things we've come across in the UK. We've had cases of organised crime going around certain cities in the UK, finding prostitutes, drug addicts, drunks, and actually buying their identities. So actually going to these people saying, we'll give you £500 for your identity. You just got to fill in this form, tell us everything about yourself. And of course, you know, you're a drug addict, someone offers you 500 quid, you're going to accept it. They then use that identity in a photograph of an illegal immigrant, and they apply for a passport. Background checks actually work. The background checks find that identity exists, national insurance number, everything's there, and they issue them a passport. So you can actually get a fraudulently obtained genuine passport. Now, obviously, we put in a lot better checks nowadays, and we're fighting this constant battle to prevent these things from happening. We've got other examples of people stealing identities on the internet, and it's very easy to get into someone else's computer, and on their computer is their whole life. And even when you're actually using things like Facebook or Google, you don't realize it often, but you are paying them for their services with your personal information. Your personal information is valuable, and that's what they're using as currency, your personal information. So you need to be very careful about how you use it. So with that, I'm going to pass on to the Right Honourable Alan Michael to look at internet governance.
Hi everybody. I think the reason that this is quite important from a parliamentarian's point of view, and I think it's helpful it's been brought up as such an important issue by the British Computer Society, is that there is an issue of confidence. More and more public services are going online, so it's not just the things you choose to do, it's actually the things you need in everyday life, and basic services that are dealt with online. And that's increasingly happening at a time when the money's short, and you can do it more cheaply by putting things online. That's fine, but there's considerable evidence that a very significant proportion of the public, in the UK at least, would not go online even if you gave them a free high-level broadband service and a computer for nothing. And that is, to some extent, a question of fear. An old friend of mine ran a club for elderly people called Computers for the Terrified, which was quite nice because it actually admitted that it wasn't stupid to be fearful, it wasn't unusual, and therefore you could start addressing those fears and look at how to be secure online. But when it comes to question of identity, I love this picture. I don't know if you can see it because it's a slightly washed out picture, but it's the annual event when the Queen comes to Parliament. And you can see just to the left of Prince Philip there is the Queen, and she's giving the Queen's speech. Actually, it's not the Queen's speech. It's written by the Prime Minister and says what the government thinks. Whether the Queen thinks those things or not is a total secret, and she reads it out in the most dull monotone in order to indicate no enthusiasm either for or against the content. So we have an identity, but the thing is everybody knows who it is, really. And we also know who wrote the speech. There are other inconsistencies in the British Constitution, but I won't bore you with them. But I think that picture does reflect the fact that identity issues have been around for a very long time. Oh, I wouldn't know about that. I mean, it would take an American to think of such a substitution. There are also issues about how you deal with legislation in this area. As a legislator, I'm very reluctant for us to legislate unless we're absolutely sure what the impact is going to be. And I've said on many occasions that the impact in relation to internet issues is highly unpredictable. Things are changing so fast, things are moving so fast. Just to give one example, a few years ago when we had the bombings in London, the telephone network collapsed under the weight of use, people trying to find out where their friends were, their relatives were, and all the rest of it. This year, during riots in a number of our cities, that didn't happen. Smartphones, the change in technology had moved on very, very rapidly. So if we'd been legislating on how to deal with those issues, for instance, one suggestion was that you close down the public network in order to let the emergency services have their service, we would be completely out of date by the present time. At the same time, during events this summer, police saw Twitter and Facebook being used a lot. Members of gangs were directing each other to where the next break-in was going to be. Did they think of closing it down? No, nobody gave a thought to any such idea. What happened was there was more positive engagement, so the police went on saying, that's where you're going, we're coming too. Which is about intelligent use of the system. And I think that makes it all the more important that what we are doing is making clear what principles and responsibilities are, rather than trying to put in place regulations and legislation that is technology specific or specific to a particular point of the development of these ways of using communications. Going on to the next slide, of course, part of the problem, but also part of the strength, and part of the reason why the IGF is so important is the fact that there is no central control of the internet. There are many organisations that got a finger in the pie, the UN, the ITU, and so on and so forth. And there are drivers of identity, if we go to the next slide, which again are ever more complex, and in day-to-day life people are making choices which are based on assumption of knowing who they are engaging with. So that raises the questions for identity governance within the wider issues of internet governance that we've been debating all this week. So, who would be appropriate? United Nations? I don't think so. A top-down bureaucratic response is the one that we've avoided through the creation of the IGF process. Who could have the remit and authority? Is it a question of control or is it a question of standards? I put the co-op in there as a suggestion because actually cooperative governance is a lot more sophisticated than most other forms of human governance, and in a way the IGF model is a cooperative model. I'm a Labour and cooperative MP, so I would argue that's from a point of political principle as well as valid. It's also a problem, I think, that many of the issues are discussed in silos. A number of occasions I've been asked to chair or participate in events which bring people together to talk about the issue of privacy, and then a week later you're with a different group of people talking about how to exploit the potential of the technology or different forms of software. And you have those discussions in these two separate silos, whereas what you need is those two lots of people who are interested in those two aspects in the same room, talking to each other and listening to each other and trying, as we do through the IGF process, to take themselves forward to a consensus. The big danger is that we're always driven by the last disaster or the last newspaper headline or the last set of events. One of the things that's impressed me this week in particular, by the way, is a number of speakers that we've heard from Egypt, where I thought they would be reflecting some of the headlines that we've seen in our newspapers about the importance of social networks for communication. And they haven't. Their comments have been much more sophisticated than that, and much more wide-ranging, and much more in the area that we need to be of taking account of different problems, sometimes in different countries, sometimes in different contents, sometimes within an individual country. So the question is, how can we balance privacy and security? They're both important. If we have a conversation that's purely about privacy or purely about security, we won't come to the right answer. How can trust in remote identities on the internet be achieved and maintained? And what governance model would be appropriate for managing identities on the internet? And I think as a parliamentarian, as a legislator, I'm very interested in hearing different views about how we could respond to those issues.
Thank you very much, Alan. Before I open up the dialogue to everyone in the room, I've been very impressed by the IGF and talking to people here and about by the participation in the workshops and the multiplicity of stakeholders that are here. But I've certainly felt very strongly that business, finance and e-commerce has been an underrepresented group in this multi-stakeholder dialogue. So I'm very pleased that Bill Smith from PayPal is here, and before opening to everyone else, I'd like him to talk to us about the importance of identity assurance in online transactions. Thank you, Bill.
Sure. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. And I was honored to be asked to speak. I think it's fortunate that I have about 10 years background in identity. When I was at Sun Microsystems, I helped spin up an organization known as the Liberty Alliance, and we developed a set of standards around online identity, and it did so in a federated manner. If I could have just, around the balance topic, things that we considered important then and PayPal considers important now, are anonymity, pseudonymity, and attribution. And we believe in using attribution at various levels as and when necessary. There are a set of things on the internet, interactions on the internet that require no attribution, and anonymity should be preserved. It's important to have anonymous speech. In the United States, that was a very important part of the founding of our country. the ability to speak anonymously, and it's embedded in our Constitution. In order to also balance, though, one of the things to look at when you're looking at attribution is what is the context in which you are operating in, what is the purpose, what is the environment you are in, and what are your risk or threat models that you're operating under. At PayPal, we basically every transaction we're looking at risk, and we're making decisions based on risks in the moment, based on a variety of factors that I won't describe because I'm not allowed to. But it's because that's it's a security thing for us. But you can look at credit card companies and things that they might do. I'm sure everyone here is, or likely people here have had this happen, where you attempt to purchase something and the merchant says, well, the credit card company wants to talk to you. And what they're trying to do is they're saying, well, your behavior is a little unusual. How we're seeing this card used seems unusual for you. You've never been to someplace, or you never travel, and all of a sudden you are someplace. We will do the same types of things, coming in from a strange IP address. It's important to remember there are stages for identity. It was discussed earlier around authentication, but there's also authorization, and then finally audit. Authentication is around, do you have a credential? I'm a US citizen, I have a passport. It's a credential. What it does is it is federated. This is acceptable in any country on the planet, I believe, as a form of identification. And it can be used to authenticate who I am by looking at my picture and does it match? The vetting that is necessary for this, for the production of this credential, is federated. Each of the countries on the planet is allowed to issue passports. It's their responsibility to make sure that the identities are in fact correct, that it's a valid document and it ties to a true person. And there are problems with this, as was pointed out. The problems in the real world, there are problems in the virtual world. Other things that are important are trust, and that's done by typically agreements. In the business world, if you're going to do a federated system, you have to have trust in the party on the other side. And another thing for businesses, where and when does the liability move? What is the flow of liability? If you think in the credit card industry, you have merchant banks, the issuing bank for the card, and the liability flows from one to the other at various stages in the transaction. And it's always known where the liability rests, and that's why at times you will have to enter additional information to engage in a transaction. This would be true, and we think should be true online as well. When you are attempting to do a blog post, you could be anonymous. Right? Be a reasonable thing to do. You might want to know, or the site might want to know, well, this is the same person coming back blogging again, but we don't need to know who they are. I'm certain I'm going to want attribution when we're engaging in commercial transactions. PayPal certainly wants to know who we are dealing with. Our merchants want to know either who they are dealing with, or that there is someone who is standing by and backing, in this case PayPal, a payment. And so I think how can you get trust in identities? Well, one way is through some model of federation, and possibly a governance model would be multilateral MLATs, multilateral treaties, whether they are from businesses, governments, or some other mechanism. And we should look in the real world for solutions in the virtual world. My passport, again, is a credential. Am I authorized to enter Kenya? Well, I have a visa. The visa is tied to my passport. It's actually physically tied, but it also specifies my passport number and other things. And that allows me entry in here. I'm authorized. It is separate from the credential that says who I am. Okay? And we need to do things, we need to look at those types of things as well, and those decisions get made in the moment. Okay? If I'm coming in from Kenya attempting to transfer, all of my life savings, my bank should ask me for additional information. Right? They should not just say, oh great, you entered your username, password, and it's a very weak password, and we're going to transfer your life savings to some, I won't pick a country, but some less than reputable country, and not in Africa. I would want them to ask for additional information, right? And they should. And it should be because of the context of the transaction. Am I authorized to do it? What's the risk? Okay. And too often in computer systems, we have not implemented our systems that way. We do username and password to a system, and once you are in, you can do anything. Right? Whatever it is that you are authorized to do, you can do it. There are no checks made after the fact. And that is something we certainly don't agree with, and that we evaluate risk on each and every transaction. And so I think that's an important part of identity. There are significant issues with security. We have issues with security and national security, but we think it's important to protect anonymity, protect privacy, and then also give the tools to us and law enforcement to mitigate crime and to go after the bad guys and prosecute when we can. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Bill. I'd like to open the dialogue to everyone now, and in order to keep a good flow, if you want to say something that is a real follow-on or a clarification from the previous person, if you put your hand up with one finger, I'll know you're doing that. If you want to start a new topic, can you put your hand up with... Okay. Because we're having a bit of trouble with remote participation, could I bring in a remote participant first?
Thank you. Yes, we have Dee Williams in St. Lucia, who has observed, it's an observation and perhaps might deserve some comment from the panel, that there appears to be a clash, which they noticed in the Caribbean, between privacy, which is a European basic principle, and openness, which is a US basic principle. And they say it can get quite uncomfortable because, at least here in St. Lucia, we have a tendency to rest on privacy, i.e. the European principle. I just wonder what the panel might think about that. Thank you.
Thank you. Who'd like to answer that? Would you like to answer that, Andy?
I mean, I think this is why an international debate is necessary, apart from the business of negotiations between governments and so on, because that comes out and has come out in the debates during this week. Sometimes one person's absolutely iron principle is open to question by others, and you have to actually go behind that and discuss it through before you can understand how to apply principles in relation to the internet. So I think it's an important point that's made.
Sure. Bill Smith. Again, recognizing there are very strong differences between the U.S., how the U.S. views privacy and how it's viewed potentially in the rest of the world, but certainly in Europe. At the same time, the two systems can interoperate, and we do interoperate, or operate in parallel. In terms of, is there a conflict between privacy and openness? I actually don't think so. We respect individuals' right to privacy. We should, I think, generally in the United States, at least, respect it more. But at the same time, openness, I've made this comment in another session, if I'm engaging in a transaction or some communication on the internet, I have a right, or should be able to, know who I am transacting with or communicating with if I choose to. If I want to know who I'm communicating with, I should be able to ask and should be able to get a reasonable answer back. Certainly if I'm engaged in a commercial transaction, I want to know who I'm dealing with so that should the transaction fall through, I have some way to redress. In addition, I have to, typically when I'm engaging in those types of transactions, I have to hand over personally identifiable information. I want to know who I'm handing it to. So the openness for entities engaged in commercial transactions is important, and this is in EU law, that, at least in certain countries, on a website, if you're engaged in transactions, you must publish who you are. It has to be on the website. So I think there is a balance, and there's a difference between an individual, or in the EU terminology, a natural person not engaged in commercial activities. They have a right in the EU to privacy. But that right, and even if it were this true in the US, that right is not absolute. For example, in the United States, if I am involved in a traffic accident, I have an obligation to disclose who I am, my driver's license, my car registration, my proof of insurance, considerable amount of information that I have to turn over. In the US, there aren't many, if any, restrictions on what I can do with that when I hand it over. But the other party, and as this was pointed out earlier, the other party has a right to that information as well, because I have, it's not a criminal activity, but I've been engaged in something where there is potential conflict. And both parties have a right to the information at that point. And privacy is, in a sense, trumped at that point.
I think you wanted to follow on this point.
Yes, I'd like to take up on that because
Could you give
basically
your
I'm an
name
attorney in
first?
Washington.
Could you give your name for the record?
Yes,
first?
I'm an attorney in Washington, D.C., and my name is Patrice Lyons. In recent years, it's become more focused insofar as the representation of the information about your identity in digital form, which is really what we're talking about and how to manage that. That there are different kind of privacy contexts, and most of them right now that I see that are terribly important have root in the law. And we've been working on new apps in the medical care area, and Health and Human Resources Home has very specific privacy requirements. Some of them you can debate whether they're required or not, but it all depends on what information it is, represented in digital form, that you're supposed to maintain in privacy. I've written lots of non-disclosure agreements where you have to say you can't take this information and put it out on the internet, but you can use that internet capability to actually convey the information, perhaps encrypt it, whatever.
Okay.
Thank you. My name is Mariam Mamar-Sadeghi. I'm here as part of a Freedom House delegation. There's 15 of us from different countries, and I'm originally from Iran, and I run an NGO project called Tavana, E-Learning Institute for Iranian Civil Society. And I'm very new to a lot of what is being discussed, and I'm trying to understand, and just wanted to suggest also for the discussion that just as though there are different standards between Europe and the United States perhaps, there's a very big difference between how repressive regimes operate and how free governments operate. And while human rights are universal, the way that corporations and technologies function in these two very different contexts are very different. And so what is a good technology or a good internet governance approach for the free world, or even the partly free world, has very different uses and effects in a country like Iran where we operate. We have to take many protocols and steps technologically and in terms of our human resources to ensure the anonymity of the students who come and take classes at our online institute. Having said all that, Iran is also a country, people who are familiar with Iran are very conscious of the national security threats about terrorism and how the internet and its openness are used and manipulated by terrorists and by governments to spread terror.
Thank you very much. Would you like to, Andy? Yes.
This is something that I actually have quite a bit of experience with. I spent a couple of years working in Saudi Arabia, Dubai, Bahrain, And it's very interesting there. You get the government, even the GSM network doesn't have encryption turned on, basically, so the government can listen into every single telephone call. All in the name of national security. So they've gone to the other extreme. And you don't have privacy somewhere like Saudi, which is a shame. And it's because of those sorts of countries that go to that extreme, like China's one that everyone picks up on, that countries in the West go to the other extreme and go to the, we want pure anonymity and privacy and we don't want to share information. And I think we need, on a more global basis, to try and find how we can get this balance right, so that people in Iran have their right to privacy, but it doesn't affect how much the state worries about national security and denigration of culture. And people in the West don't go over the top with the privacy and prevent law enforcement doing their jobs properly. So I think it's a real conversation that needs to be had around this.
Yes.
What I meant is more that the Iranian regime, it's not a concern for their interest in national security. It's that as activists, we're concerned about how they repress citizens using the internet.
Yeah. So this is the other part of it. It's they're not just. And in Saudi, it's very obvious. It's not so much about looking for criminal activity. It's looking for anyone who wants to denigrate the culture. They've got very fixed views on what the culture should be and what people should do as part of that culture. And if they see anything that goes against that, if they see people wanting to have their freedom, and I mean, if you tried sort of walking down the road in Riyadh with a Bible, you'd basically wouldn't last very long. But you should have the right to do that. If you want to read the Bible in Riyadh, you should have the right to do that. But it's again on the online stuff. They're looking for people in Saudi who are trying to look at the Bible online, or trying to look at things that are not part of their culture. And because they're doing that, and doing it for the wrong reasons, it actually makes it very hard then to justify the national security aspects in other countries.
Yeah. Okay. Bill, you wanted to say something on that?
Yes, I think in response, for me, this is one of the reasons why it's important to be able to be anonymous, pseudonymous, and to rely on attribution, and that they're used at appropriate times. In a repressive regime, anonymity is going to be far more important, and extra measures will need to be taken. But if there is an identity architecture, as long as it supports these things, it will be possible. If it doesn't support these things, it will be impossible. In my country, people want to be anonymous at times. I understand the need in a repressive regime to be extra careful, but I just think it's important that the architecture support it, and we shouldn't ignore repressive regimes, nor should we, in my opinion, design everything around that. But we need to be aware of it, and hopefully the world will move away from repressive regimes to more open.
I'm going to take one follow-up on that and then go to Bob, who's been trying to get in since the beginning. Okay. Yeah, that's right, yes.
Okay, I'm Tapani Talvainen from Electronic Frontier Finland. Just like to note that I've actually lived in Riyadh and known people how they hide their Bibles there. And I have a friend who is a Syrian dissident, and I have very much values anonymity. But the key point here was some mechanisms that work in democratic societies and some but do not work well in oppressive regimes is a very important point. But also, the regimes can change from democratic to oppressive, like Nazis did win the election. So we should try to develop such systems that actually work only in democratic societies, at least to the extent that they are not too effective for oppressive regimes. Basically, we should consider, if I'm a government now, democratic government, what kind of measures shall I set up that will not be useful if I turn bad? And basically, the police should not be too efficient. It should not be so efficient that it can keep the majority of the population under control. Thank you.
I'm going to go to Bob now.
That was one of the points that I made about the Nazis going into the Netherlands. The Netherlands had a very open democratic society. An oppressive regime came in and then used the information they had to their advantage. And you're right, we've got to make sure that any models we set up on the internet, if a regime changes, they can't suddenly make use of that for the wrong reasons.
Okay.
Okay. No, I'm inclined to almost talk about encrypted Bibles, but let me not go down that path. I think any discussion about identifiers really has to bring into play both the policy aspects, which we've been addressing so far today, and the technology that would support it. They really don't exist independent of each other. I've had a long history of dealing with identifiers, and I am currently involved in identity management stuff in a very serious way, having to do with discovery of authenticated information. Let me just say that in the history of identifiers on the internet, for the most part, they've all been very technology dependent. And I think that's a big mistake. And in the future, I think what we need to do is look for identifier systems that don't depend on the technology that implements them. I think that's possible to get to. If you look at the history of computer networking, the very first network I was involved with was ARPANET way back when, and we did identify, I mean, that was kind of like the very first Internet of Things, because it was just about machines, and every machine was identified by the wire to which it was connected to the net. That would not stand the test of time, obviously, especially since that net no longer exists. When we got into the internet environment, we created IP addresses. And even that, you could argue, is somewhat technology dependent, because we could move from IPv4 to v6, and old addresses may not be valid at some point in the future. Even URLs today are very much dependent on the technology of the day, whether it be DNS or file conventions in machines and the like, and that could all change. So the approach that we've taken is to simply say that let us deal with a technology-independent identifier approach, and for the things that we want to identify, if you think about it writ large, you know, most people start thinking about identity management in terms of actual users, but in fact, we need to broaden that out to talk about all the resources that are out there on the net, whether they be, you know, applications, computational services, whatever it is that's being dealt with, as well as the information that's produced along the way. It could be that a person wrote something, you want to get the thing that they wrote, you may want to identify that separately, as the publishers have now been doing for more than a decade in a very technology-independent way. Or you may just want to identify things that came out of a service that were produced at a given point in time. If you're going to go down that path, then you're going to have undoubtedly, over time, different identifier systems. And so we've got to deal with some of the issues of interoperability. But I want to pop up a level and just, let's assume we could agree on a mechanism today. I mean, well, you could have one kind of identifier that's just a binary string that exists in a net. That's how data gets routed through a net and things like that. But another way of identifying people is by virtue of the credential that they keep. And for me, the most effective credential is the private key. Now, when you use a private key to authenticate yourself to someone else, or you use someone else's private key to authenticate them to you, all you're really doing is basically saying that the party that I'm dealing with is the party that currently holds the private key. So you get another layer of mapping that has to now take place, and that is who is this private key supposedly assigned to, and who had the trust to make that mapping. And so if it's Alan and he's got a private key, who is it that basically understood that he is who he purports to be, or that Queen Elizabeth is who she purports to be? So somebody's got to be able to make that assertion with authenticity. Now, there are a lot of ways you can do it. You can say, look, just trust me, I know who they are, and since you trust them, you trust that they made the right judgment. But more generally, it's probably going to be an organization that's going to do a little more in-depth analysis. Most governments, for example, when they credential their employees, they do background checks, they might talk to members of their family, friends and relatives, they might even do DNA testing. For all I know, there are various levels of penetration that they can get into to make sure that the party that they are saying maps to this identifier is in fact the party that would appear to be. So given that, the very first question for me that comes up is, to what extent can information about this identifier be made known publicly, and to what extent must information about the identifier be kept private? That's a very fundamental question. And along with that comes the question of the extent to which anonymous identity can be sustained in the internet environment, and for what purposes. Now, we know there are some activities in life where you cannot easily do them anonymously, like travel around the world. You really need a passport. It's got to be credentialed, usually by a government authority. They can be forged, and therefore you're always looking for, the proper representation of that credential. But I personally think anonymity in the internet is going to be around and should be around for a long time, but on the other hand, not for everything. And so how do we make that judgment? So then how do you validate an identity? If somebody gives you one or you get it by discovery, how do you know that that's the right one? You want to look for Bill's email address. And somebody says, oh, we run that service, here it is. Now you're trying to have a private discussion with him. Well, maybe he can validate himself, and so you don't care whether they gave you the right email address, because your first exchange with him is to say, do you remember the thing we talked about at the last meeting we had? And he said, huh? And so pretty well you're wondering either he's got a bad memory or it's not the right person. Another way to deal with this, normally these identities are given out by organizations which I'll just generally label as trust frameworks. There are many different terms that are used for it. But how do you know that this is a trust framework that you want to depend on to do that mapping? Well, one way to do it is for places that you trust to be in that business and maintain lists of trusted organizations. And so if they say this is an organization you can trust, maybe you trust it because you trust that organization. But that leads to the next question about how the trusted organizations find out about each other. What do they do to make those determinations? And have they done the in-depth analysis that you would have expected a given trust organization to do about somebody that they were identifying? And then the final comment I wanted to make is about interoperability. I think we have to assume we're going to have different ways of identifying things. And there may be different ways to disambiguate one system from another, but I think if we could agree on a meta-level approach to mapping between these systems, it will save us a huge amount of grief in the future. And if we put our focus on these meta-level aspects, it will serve us very well going forward. People have often asked me, why is it that the internet has been around for so long? I mean, if you look at most technologies in the world, they come and, a few years later, they're obsoleted by something else. And the internet's been here for 40 years, and it looks like it, in some way, shape, or form, will continue on into the foreseeable future. I think the reason, in my personal opinion, is it was not about specific technology. I mean, the internet was not about a specific network. It was not about ATM. It was not about Ethernet. It was not about fiber rings. It was a general mechanism whereby different components, whether they be networks, computers, application services, could all work together. And at that level, it's above all the technology. It's what I call a meta-level architecture. It's an open architecture. But by being at this meta level, you ensure that whatever you invest in can sustain over time as technology changes and evolves. And I think that's the real challenge here. A good meta level structure for dealing with not only identity, but all the mechanisms that assure that identity is valid is really what we should be shooting for. So thank you for letting me expound like that. But I think that's a good basis for thinking about these problems.
I think that's an excellent basis. Ian, have we got any other remote questions?
Well, there's a comment again from Dee, which says that, really following on from this particular discussion, which was just that she can speak and expect that people listen to my words without jumping to conclusions by looking at me. And she also said the bit about, which we were originally going to include in our presentation, about on the internet nobody knows you're a dog, and I've just gone back and said that yes, but somebody probably has a profile on you that says you're a particular type of dog with a specific colouring and that you really love a particular dog food. And she said that's why I don't belong to Facebook, so.
Okay, and there was another there.
Hello, hi, Raf Fatani, Saudi Arabian Strategic Internet Consultancy. Well, I know what was discussed earlier is broader than the Saudi context. I think we can't take away the importance and the genuine terrorism concerns that come with this. So yes, whilst the privacy is quite important, and what I might say now is very controversial, I would take away the right of someone to bring in a Bible in the country over the death of people in another country, because it is about checks and balances, and you can't take one away from another. And that is in the Saudi context. Within a global context, terrorism still exists, and the right of anonymity is important. However, the right of people's lives, if saved via that, is also as crucial. Thank you.
I think you're absolutely right. I think in human rights it's very important that we emphasize the right of the victim or the potential victim is a very important part of that context.
Can I just make a comment on that? I thought somebody made a very good point yesterday of saying that in looking at the UN Charter of Human Rights, we should be looking at all the rights that are listed in that, and making sure that we've understood the need for checks and balances. Otherwise, there's no point in having a whole charter. You could just have a single right.
If I could follow up on that, I absolutely agree. I mean, we at PayPal we want to be able to mitigate crime. That's the group I am in. There are analogies to terrorism. We prefer to keep them separate because when we start talking about espionage, terrorism, warfare in a cyber context, it causes people to basically become very heightened emotionally. Okay, and so we say let's just look at the crime aspects, and for us actually it's hard money crime, not even intellectual property theft. Okay, let's just look at this and see what we can do. Even in that context, though, we still believe strongly in the right to anonymity. Okay, and privacy, but we can, even without some information, track down, okay, and go back on some criminal activity. And I would argue that can be done as well with terrorism. It is a balance. We have to respect the right of people to be anonymous, and at the same time, we have to be cautious about what that may bring and how we, those of us who are responsible for tracking down crime or terrorism, right? What are the tools available to us, and make sure there is a balance there. So, I think it is possible to do both.
I think, Ian, you were indicating there was someone I wasn't seeing who was. Yeah, right.
Hi, my name is Alexey Cherneo. I am IT consultant for NGO Assembly of Belarus. I would like to boil down to a bit shorter form those concerns which were raised by Mariam, and ask for the comment from PayPal representative. For us, it's kind of nightmare, the idea when there will be introduced a global authority for identities on the internet, where every netizen will be required to have just one identity, because it will make us pariahs on the internet, because we need to be anonymous, but almost all services will be oriented only on netizens with one identity. So we will be kind of pushed away from global network. So I would like to ask what PayPal as a business identity would think about the idea, which partly was covered here, when our identity would be based on cryptographic keys, when I as a netizen would be able to generate different keys, identity keys, my signature keys, to use for different entities. One for PayPal, one for Google, one for my government.
PayPal does not subscribe to the belief of a single identity. So to answer that question, I don't think it's a good idea to have a single identity for everything online. When you're dealing with PayPal, though, we expect you to be using an identity that we recognize, which is a PayPal identity. Stepping aside from with my PayPal hat off, though, there are ways, as I mentioned earlier, to do federated mechanisms where you can have lots of identities. You could do cryptographic things, but when you are engaged in certain transactions, it's important for the people you are engaged with to actually know who you are. Okay, there are those types of transactions, or to know that where your identity came from, the assertion for this, that there is trust there, and from a business perspective, that if there are issues with that identity and the transactions that follow from that or are authorized as a result, that the liability flows in the right direction at the right time. So no, we do not subscribe to the belief in a single identity. I think that's a mistake. With respect to the specific suggestion around different cryptographic signatures for different things, I don't think we have a position on that.
Thanks. You wanted to pick up on that?
Yes, just a quick point, and Tapani Talvainen again, Electronic Frontier Finland. The point of multiple identities is very good, but even PayPal does not really need to know who you really are. All you need to know that you can pay what you say you can pay. Just like when you are buying something with cash, you don't need to prove who you are, as long as you can prove that your money is good.
So actually, there are times when we do need to know. We are a regulated money transfer agent, and we have reporting requirements when we see certain types of activity. So it's important for us to know. Yes, we can do things more anonymously, but there are...
That's not a commercial requirement, that's a legal requirement.
It's a legal requirement, and then there will be commercial requirements as well in terms of, as a money transfer agent. We can only we have limits on how much we can allow an identity to, business to engage in before we have to cut it off.
Just very quickly, that the legal requirements are one thing we are discussing, what they should be. So I understand that you now have them, but you need to have that type of kind of requirements is the key point.
No, let's
Yes, I mean, we do. Okay, these laws are around money laundering, terrorism, okay, and I believe very strongly that yes, we do need to maintain those laws.
This is actually quite an important point. There is often only one organisation that needs to know your root identity and needs to know who you really are, and that's the government. And quite often that's not even for criminal prosecution. If you commit a crime, what the law enforcement and judicial process needs to know is that the person that committed the crime is the person they put in prison. They don't even need to know you are who you claim to be. They don't really care what you're called. They just care that the person that committed the crime is the person that's punished. When it comes to online transactions, quite often it is the case that you need to be able to prove that the person performing the transaction is able to accept the liability and is able to pay. There are a lot of laws around money laundering, around criminal fraud, etc., which require a level of knowledge of the identity. But quite often that can be used as long as the organisation that's actually performing the financial transactions has access to that information should they need it. The transactions themselves, you can use zero knowledge proof of knowledge or one-way trust actually in the transactions, so the identities themselves can be pseudo-anonymous or linked to a root identity. You don't actually need to prove the root identity. Now, picking up on one point you made, one of the things that we're trying to do, or the British government's trying to do, is look at how you can put authentication systems in place with identity protocol conversion. So rather than trying to get everybody to use the same credentials or the same authentication mechanisms, actually putting in protocol converters so that someone can use SAML, someone else can use PKI, and you've got devices that can accept the trust from one authentication system and pass it on to another authentication system. And this will hopefully allow different systems to interact with each other, and will actually try and get some of these commercial models more stable.
Yeah.
So again, to follow up on, I will say a bit about what you said, but I mainly wanted to follow up on Bill's comment. I mean, what you described is one possible way to proceed. There will inevitably be other ways of doing it as well, and we'll have to sort them all out. But the example that you gave, Bill, about two parties interacting that rely on PayPal, and PayPal identifiers come into play, it works well when there is a trusted third party that both parties rely on, which would be the case here. You're trying to pay somebody, they're trying to accept the money, and they accept PayPal as an intermediary. Another variant of that is that party A has some organization that can vouch for it. Party B has some organization that can vouch for it, but they don't rely on a single other party. So those two trusted parties then may have to interact. And that's what you see in the mobile telephone world. You go out with a phone, you're registered with, I don't know, Verizon in the US, and you show up in Italy and get on Italian net with a chip that's been backed by Vodafone, and the Italian net has an agreement with Vodafone, which has an agreement. So these things transitively pass back, and your identity is essentially validated through agreements between other parties. Now, they were essential parties as opposed to just ones that you relied on for authentication. But I think the really interesting question is when two parties try and interact directly with each other, and one has an identity and the other's identity, and they don't necessarily have an intermediate or a set of intermediate parties that are relevant to this particular transaction for whatever reason. And you can always push it back into the mode where they are forced to rely on those, and those guys do all the adjudication. But from a research and policy perspective, it'd be very interesting to see if two parties can just have those transactions directly, be able to authenticate them when there is no central party that's essentially guaranteeing the identity. Thank you.
I got any
So-
quick answer, and then
Okay, then we'll follow up on Bob's point. I agree with you on the research question. I think some things that would be useful potentially are reputation based on identities, and that I could look at your reputation, you could look at mine in some ways and decide whether we're going to trust each other. In terms of with the...
I'm willing to just trust you directly.
On the telephones, mobile phones, they really do all subscribe to a more or less common agreement, though. In fact, stuff comes through the ITU around payment systems. So the fact that they are phone companies, they agree to exchange information and to make they're contractually obligated to honor the other.
There's a nuance on that. There's a nuance on that I noticed when we came to Kenya, where you have the identifier associated with the chip, and that identifier is used, it's registered, and on the basis of that registry, as I understand the system, you can pay all sorts of bills. And that identifier then is essentially the identifier for the individual that they're using for other purposes. But the actual agreements, I never got all the agreements to see how that works. But it wouldn't just be through the ITU, and it wouldn't just be mobile phone to mobile phone. They'd have to have agreements with the electric company, the grocery store, and whatever. So it'd be a whole complex of things that you'd have to work out. As far as I'm aware, I'd have to look into it further.
Is there anyone from the Kenyan mobile payment system here who could tell us how it really works? Yeah, M-Pesa.
My understanding on that is that it's the local carrier is the one who's on the hook for the funds, right? Because the having a bank account here is a rarity, but having a mobile phone account is very common.
But it's also, for example, giving money to a rural area, so they're actually playing banker in some ways. But in doing that, there has to be some way to have identification of the actual other party, and that's through, I guess, this registry system.
Is there a new question?
Yes, thank you very much. Sophie Kwasny from the Council of Europe. Thank you for this very interesting discussion. Clearly, for me, I think the point I'd like to highlight is this link and this balance with privacy, anonymity. There are different levels. In terms of service of governments, we've seen Mr. Laroux calling for anonymity in e-government service. Commercial purposes, we just mentioned reputation. We can take the example of eBay, where it's a community that is trusting the other on the fact that users have granted support and trust to someone. Maybe what I'd like to say is that at European level, we are now revising the legal frameworks, both EU and Council of Europe. And the question of biometric data is a very sensitive data. It's not yet defined by sensitive data, and I think the whole context of the use of the data has to be studied. And finally, I would like to raise the issue of the reliability of the system and of the identity assurance. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Anyone? Yeah.
Hi, I'm Brian Huseman from Intel Corporation. And just to kind of echo the comments about biometric data as a form of authentication, there's a lot of technological developments going on with facial detection and facial recognition technology. And, facial recognition obviously has privacy risk, and security risk associated with it, but there's also potential benefit of it being used in a pro-identity way, in a pro-privacy way. For example, there's technology that's under development that would use facial recognition as a means of encrypting and decrypting files on your computer. So unless your face is in front of your computer, then the file will not be decrypted. But so I think there are other forms of identity that are being developed technologically that obviously privacy and security are going to have to be a key part of that development.
I think that's a very good point. There was a system that's starting to be used in hospitals in the UK that won an award last year, which is facial recognition of doctors and other people who have access to sensitive data. And so they can all be logged onto the same machine. As soon as they walk away and their face is not there, no one can see that data. It's closed down. It saves a lot of time and gives privacy to medical records. I think it's a very exciting way of doing it. I think it seems to me that that's also, I use my biometric to log on to my machine. It seems much safer than anything else, and it's much quicker. And I think people often say biometrics bad, but I think in identity things, they can protect your privacy extremely well. Yeah, sorry.
Again, I think that
I've done quite a lot of work in biometrics, mainly around identification of people traveling across borders. And in Europe, a lot of countries have now started implementing automated gates which use facial recognition. And this is actually a really good system. It does improve privacy, but it also significantly improves security, because what you have is the facial image stored as a digital image on the chip, which is electronically signed using a PKI. You have an automated gate which checks the signature on the facial image, so can be sure that the facial image was put there by the passport authority issuing the passport. It does a biometric check of that face against the one that's printed on the page and against the individual standing in front of the gate. Does a three-way comparison before it lets you through. But it's only comparing the facial images and the information stored on the chip. So there's nobody looking at your personal data. So you get the benefit of both. And more you're seeing fingerprints used in recognition systems. And if you can tie a person's identity to the individual using immutable credentials like biometrics, it does actually make things a lot better because it prevents people stealing the identities, or makes it a lot harder to steal the identities, because you've actually got to replicate whichever biometrics are used. And if you see like the EAC, the Enhanced Access Control System that's being implemented on European passports, with that, you've got a choice of fingerprints that you use. So if you want to get across the border and they've got fingerprints implemented, you haven't just got to replicate fingerprints off of one hand, you've got to replicate fingerprints off of both hands to achieve it. This makes things a hell of a lot more secure.
So I just want to point out that these are all mechanisms that can be used, but ultimately you are dependent on a trusted party that can then validate the information. The fact that somebody has your image doesn't mean that they're going to necessarily maintain the database that's separate that matches your image with the person you are. In the same way, somebody could have a DNA reading, right, from yourself, and somebody can have a false DNA database that maps it to something else. So even if you contain it on your own machine, then you become your own authority, and you have to say what I'm putting in there I'm going to vouch for and then rely on it. But ultimately, these are mechanisms, and they do depend on trusted third parties in order to make them work.
Is there anyone who hasn't caught my eye who wants to say something, because there's another remote person?
Thank you. Just so you don't think that I'm only talking to St. Lucia, I'm also talking to Brendan Querbis, I think it's pronounced, in Syracuse, New York. And he wonders, he said he missed some of the conversation, but he was curious if the US NSTIC had come up and how it may be shaping global governance for online identity.
The simple answer is it hasn't come up, but Bill is
Yeah, I'm dying to bring it. No, no, NSTIC has not come up, and I am familiar with it. We'll see where it goes. It's the U.S. government making I think a good effort at bringing private industry together with government. So I don't know that it applies here.
right. Is there anyone else who hasn't spoken who would?
Hi, my name is Alon Bar. I'm an independent consultant. I have listened patiently and with interest to all the statements that have been made, but I'm a bit sad that I have heard very little about the actual concerns that do exist with the right to privacy. Hearing about the ease with which we are putting our biometric data, make it available, store it online, even though we are so aware of the quite serious concerns that exist for safety procedures. The fact that hardly any computer system in the world can be secure against attacks or against theft. Raise my question if the comments in some of the some of the principles upheld here by some of the panelists, whether there is indeed a support for such a thing as the right to privacy. Thank you.
One of the points on that you really need to take into account, if you're doing a biometric system properly, if you're taking fingerprints, you don't store the raw fingerprint images on the credential, you store the template. That means that someone can't recreate the template. Yes, they can steal it, but they can only steal that template. Templating, digitally signing the biometrics so that they can't be used unless they are signed by the correct authority, also prevents biometrics being misused. And encrypting biometrics, and we were looking at systems where you actually encrypt you digitally sign and encrypt the biometrics as they come off of the reader, so that they can't be intercepted. And then only those with the right private keys are able to decrypt the biometrics to do the comparison. It is a case of putting the protection mechanisms around them, and the more that biometrics are used, the more easily available they are on the internet, the harder it's going to be to regain control of that. But I think the mechanisms that certainly the European government's putting in with BAC, EAC, are addressing these problems.
So to respond to the comment or the question, again, PayPal believes very strongly in right to privacy. And the other thing I would say is that, and I believe I addressed this in my opening comments, is that when information is required, attribution information is required, it should depend, or the amount of information that is asked for should be kept to a minimum, and what is appropriate for the transaction given the context in which it is happening. So it's there are times when it's a simple username and password is enough, and there are other times that I'm going to say, no, I need to really know who you are, and as a consumer, that's actually going to enhance my privacy, even though I'm being asked for additional information. In my opinion, it's going to enhance my not losing money, and potentially lots of other information if as an example, access to an information system is being granted to someone who just came in with a simple username and password. But if instead I say, well, no, you actually have to swipe your fingerprint at this point because you want to get your medical record, that enhances my privacy, even though I had to use a biometric to get it.
I'm tempted to respond to the point about you're disappointed that you hadn't heard something in the conversation that perhaps you should have come in earlier in that case. I just wanted to pick up on the question, do we believe in a right to privacy? You can't answer that question in general terms. It has to be specific. Privacy for what purpose? What aspect of privacy do you have to compromise in order to be recognized as the person who can undertake certain things, whether as a citizen or in commercial transactions? So I think that would take us right back to the beginning of the discussion. There are certain rights that should be universal in terms of privacy, but it's not an absolute right taken on its own as against the rest of the issues that come up, the rights of others as well as the rights of yourself. And that takes us back to the point they made earlier that was raised yesterday about the need to look at the whole of the human rights agenda rather than looking simply in silos of individual rights, as if any single right can be absolutely absolute, whatever the context.
I think that's absolutely right. Looking at the time, I need to wrap up now, and I'd actually like to wrap up by asking you a couple of questions and just have a show of hands on a couple of issues. We had quite a lot of talk about whether people should have one ID or many IDs. Could everyone who thinks people on the internet should just have one ID put up their hand. Everyone who thinks that you should be allowed to have many IDs. Well, that's pretty conclusive, which is actually quite helpful. Consensus, yes. The second point that I'd just like to ask you is, do people think, looking at our second question, that the way to deal with remote IDs is through trusted third parties? Do they think that is a route that is worth pursuing? And again, those who think that that is a route that's worth pursuing in this area, could you put up your hands? There's a little bit less consensus there. It depends. Okay. And those who don't think that, no? Well, so I think it's, no, but as it's, yes. Okay, well, I think we have consensus on that. Ah, right. Is that a remote?
Can I just have a final word?
Yeah.
D. Williams in St. Lucia wants to thank everybody who's here in this room for an excellent workshop.
Well, that's on that note. I think I'd like you to thank the panel, who I think have done a very good job. Thank you.